Hey, Jordan, I took a look at your questions and actually, you're doing okay. Um, I know it doesn't feel that way, but just, I don't think maybe you're as confused as you think you are. You just appear to be mixing a few things up. So when you look at the graphs, remember that a sine graph crosses at the origin, right in the middle of the wave, okay? And that a cosine graph crosses the y-axis at the peak of a wave. So that's how, when you're looking at two graphs, you're trying to tell, is this starting on the y-axis, is it starting in the middle of a wave, which would be a sine graph, or is it starting at the peak or a valley of a wave, which would be a cosine graph? Sometimes it could be confusing because it looks like it's going the opposite way. But with a sine graph, if the amplitude is negative, it flips the graph over so it goes like that. And with a cosine graph, if the amplitude is negative, it flips the sine over so it looks like that. So the first thing to do is try and decide, is it a sine? So is the middle of the wave at the y-axis? Or is it a cosine? So is there a peak or a valley along the y-axis? So that's the first thing to do. Other than that, you're just going to look, these are the basic equations for a sine or a cosine graph. And all that we're going to do is we are going to pick them apart into the component pieces exactly the same way we would figure out with the quadratic graphs. Work the same way. We're just going to pick them apart into their pieces. So what does the A stand for in these graphs? So there's your A. The A in the graph is the amplitude. And the amplitude, and don't worry, I've got some examples. The amplitude is the height of the wave. So if that's your wave, and that's your midline, the amplitude is how high the wave is, or how deep the wave is. So you could count from the top of the wave to the bottom of the next wave and divide it by 2. Or you can just count up from the middle, whichever. That is the A in your graph. If the A is a negative number, it's flipped it over. So if I go back to this little example at the bottom, if my wave looked like that, that would have a negative A. The period is the distance from peak to peak. So if this is your graph, okay, this distance from here to here, that's your period. Okay, so how long does it take your graph to get to repeat itself? And we use the period to find the b value, which is there. So the period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. So if I want to find b, and I'm looking at the graph, I can actually just see the period. To find b, I just do 2 pi divided by the period. Sometimes this is confusing. I noticed in question 3 that they rounded pi off to 3. Anyway, so that was interesting. So that's where you get your b from. So that's your amplitude. That's your b. The d is, have I moved the graph up or down along the y-axis? So all that I do is I look at what would be the midline. So of course the midline for your basic graph would be 0, right? So if I've moved it up, my d is just how many I've moved it up from the origin, or how much I've moved it down from the origin. And the c is called a phase shift. It's how much have I moved it left or right from the origin. So that we would call that a horizontal shift. So if that's my axis and I have a nice sine wave, but it's here, I can see that it's been shifted over from the origin. And if I've shifted to the right, that's a negative value for C, and if I've shifted it to the left, it's a positive value for C. So let's actually take a look at the questions. So I noticed that this first question was one of the ones that you got wrong. You actually did really well. You mixed up your last two ones. And I think you would have noticed that you actually had put E twice, which that might have been part of the problem. Anyway, so let's take a look at this first question here. Because the answer, according to Mom, should have been F. So let's take a look. I'm going to look and say, okay, I can see that it goes between 3 and -5. So that's that the whole depth of the peak of the wave is 8. So the amplitude is going to be 8 divided by 2, which is 4, is going to be my amplitude. If I look at this, I can see that at the crossing the y-axis is actually at a peak. So it's not crossing in the middle, right? It's crossing at a peak. So when it crosses at a peak, it's a cosine. So I should have this as y is equal to 4 cosine. Okay, so what's our b going to be? So I can see my period from peak to peak. The period goes from 2 to 4, so I can see that my period is 2. So my b is going to be, my b is equal to 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi over 2. So b is equal to pi, but I noticed in this graph they've rounded the pi off to 3, so my b is going to be 3. So I've got 3x. And when I look, the middle of the wave, so 4 above, 4 below, is -1. So it's been shifted down 1 along the x-axis, or the y-axis, pardon me. So that was 1. If you look, the answer that you put for this one was E, which you may have meant F, actually, thinking about it, because when I look at this, it says it's been shifted down 2, and it hasn't been. If you look, it's only been shifted down 1 from the origin, so it couldn't have been this one. When I look at a graph, the very first thing I look for is that D value. Has it been shifted up or down, and is it starting at a peak, or is it starting in the middle of a wave? So where it starts is sine or cosine, and where that center line is tells you if it's been shifted up or down. So those are the first two things I look at. So you actually got these ones right, not this one, but you got all of the other two right except for the last two. So let's take a look at those. Where is that? It's right here. So that would be A, sine minus x minus 1. They wrote it as minus x. So there it is right there. I don't know if you can see it. There it is up there. There's A. They put the minus with the x on the inside, but you could put minus sine x minus 1. The other one I noticed was this one here, question A. This one here that you marked as A was also an error. So let's take a look at that one. Okay, so if I look at this graph here, okay, where's my middle? There's my middle there, -2. I can see the middle of a wave. It starts at the middle of a wave at the y-axis, so this has to be a sine function. Okay, it's been shifted down 2, so there's going to be a -2 at the end. The amplitude, the height of the wave, is 2. So there's my A is 2. And my B is 2 pi divided by the period. So let's see, from here to here is 6. So my B is going to be equal to 2 pi over 6. So B is going to be equal to pi over 3. Because, again, it's rounding pi off to 3, B is going to be equal to 1. So it would be, if B is just 1, I could write 1x. But I'm going to write 2 sine x minus 2. which is right there. That's your value for E. Okay, this was a very messy looking graph, I realize. Okay, I'm just going to pause this and let's take a look. Okay, so if I look at this graph here, the very first thing I'm going to say is, okay, is it starting at a peak or is it starting in the middle? So I can see that the middle is here. And so it's starting in the middle. So I know this is going to be a sine function. So I know it's going to be a sine. I can see that it's been shifted down. Okay, so it's at a -1. The other thing that I can see, I know that a regular sine wave goes up through the origin like this. And this one is going down like that. So that means that your amplitude has to be negative. It's flipped over that sine graph. So let's figure out what the amplitude would be. So the height of your graph is the peak is between 0 and -2. So the height is 1. So the amplitude is 1. And because your graph has been flipped over, it's going to be a -1. So it'll be -1 sine. Okay, so now we need to figure out what your b is going to be. So I know that the b is equal to 2 pi over the period. And the period here from peak to peak, if I start here, it goes from 0 to 3. So my period is 3, so 2 pi over 3. Remember, for some reason, mom is rounding. In these ones, mom is rounding pi off to 3. So if pi is equal to 3, b would be 2 times 3 over 3. So b would be equal to 2 here. So I have -1 sine 2x minus 1. And if I go back and look at my answers, one new page here, and I'm going to reiterate what I just said. Okay, we're going to add. So remember, the base functions are y equals a sine bx minus c plus d, or y equals a cos bx minus c plus d. A is the height of the wave from the midline, and it's a minus a if the graph is flipped over. Okay. Remember that cos starts at the y-axis, is a peak or a valley. Sine at the y-axis is the midline. It crosses at the midline. So the very first thing to look for when you are looking at a graph is it a peak or a valley at the y-axis, or has it been shifted a little bit over along? But would it be a peak or a valley? And if it's crossing the y-axis at a midline, it's going to be a sine. So those are the first two things I look for. Is it a cos or is it a sine? Then the next thing I look for is the d, because the d tells you, has it been shifted up or has it been shifted down? So if d is -3, you're looking for a graph that's been shifted 3 below the x-axis. If d is +9, you're looking for a graph that's been shifted up 9 from the x-axis. And then b is equal to 2 pi over the period. That's where that comes from. And c is if it's been moved left or right, how much it's been moved left or right from the y-axis. So it's just a shift along the x-axis. So it's very much like doing quadratic functions. It's the same idea. You can use those different keys to tell you what you're looking for.